Chapter 19, Captive Interests. Captive Interests.
And stay there.
Fritha let herself fall where they dumped her. That she was tired from a night of walking was true enough, and she felt it best to play up to such things. Having them underestimate her now would only make matters easier in the long run. The forest was cold and dark, the hour well past midnight, and the clearing was eerie in the light of their swinging lanterns, trunks looming about her only to be swallowed by the darkness of the canopy above. Fritha had wondered if it were possible to find a plan that the others would have objected to as strongly as the torture of their tacit captive, but she had. She smiled faintly to herself, recalling the ringing silence that had greeted her suggestion, the way all had frozen mid-action, spoons paused halfway to open mouths and eyes unblinking, the calm before the storm as that wall of protests had hit her. They had agreed in the end, though, and there she was. She had been brave to the point of nonchalance back in camp, telling them all not to worry and that she would see them in but a few short days. How different the reality, seated there on the packed earth in amongst twisting roots upon a carpet of last autumn's rotting leaves, her head lowered and avoiding the eyes of the four men above her, feeling very vulnerable without sword or allies. Not that she was without any weapon, there was always her magic for what little she could use it for, and of course, there was her last resort. That had been the thing that had cinched it really. The others' objections finally halted as she had played this trump card, though she had failed to mention that since the return of her soul she was no longer sure that taking the form of Baal's avatar was even an option. And then there was the trick of actually turning back again. Still, perhaps she would not have to find out, and there were other reasons she had been so insistent. This plan, for all its inherent risk, as more than one of her friends had seen fit to point out, was what she needed. A challenge to the world to prove what was now still too steeped in uncertainty. She had doubts, in her path and her role there both, and if she was to know her part in the future and the prophesize, if she was the chosen one, then the fates could prove it. She would walk into the dragon's maw, and she would return unscathed. But her confirmation would have to wait, her mind back to more mundane matters as Fritha twisted her hands determinedly, trying to part her bound wrists and let the blood flow unhindered for a time. Her bonds were tight enough that circulation was becoming an issue, the last hour or so finding the tips of her fingers tingling unpleasantly, her activities ignored as the others talked above her, Captain Graven giving his orders.
Right, left, start a fire. Ambreen and Karstil get the canvas up and pass out the rations. I am going to check for any messages at the dead letter drop. I will return within the hour and I expect to see all in order. Understood.
3 pairs of feet sprang to salute.
Yes, sir.
A moment to let the crash of undergrowth fade and a decidedly more relaxed air fell over the camp, Enric moving to unpack the canvas. Fritha felt 2 malevolent grins open over her.
Well, girl, seems it's just you and us now,
leered Lev, smile bright against his tan skin, his pale hair jaundiced in the lamplight.
Yeah,
piped up his younger companion. Ambreen was thicker in body and Fritha suspected, head, his coloring that of the usual Tetheran, neat dark beard clearly grown to make him look older than his years. It was not working.
Not so tough without your friends, are you? They're no friends of mine.
Fritha spat with the expected rancor. It did not go unappreciated, Ambreen still chortling as his friend crowed,
that they ain't, girl. How does it feel to know they hated you enough to give you over to us? Leave me be,
she snapped sullenly, attention back on her feet. She was too tired to provide them with sport just then.
Oh, no, I don't think we're going to be doing that. The commander at camp doesn't approve of his soldiers having any fun, but we ain't there yet.
A round of grim chuckling. Fritha gazed up at them with cold, black eyes, a frisson of dread traveling her spine.
You touch me, and you're dead. Is that so?
Hans shoved her back into the tree behind with force enough to wind her, lungs screaming for air as she gasped no. A hand already in her hair pulling her head back while other hands ran over her struggling body, her legs pinned under her, jagged fingernails scoring her back as they squirmed their way beneath her tunic to hook under her trousers.
No. Get off, I said get off her.
Pain exploded across her back, the rude twisted ground coming up to meet her abrupt release, ARanDom almost joining her as he was barreled sideways by Leif, Enrik suddenly above, panting like he had sprinted a league, his dagger drawn and held trembling before him.
I might have stood by while you killed that prisoner, but not this.
Leif looked furious, spittle flecking his chin in his outrage. Frithia scooted back from the shower.
Get out the way, car still. That bitch killed Theron. Yeah, and Niall,
added ARanDom. Enrik held fast.
You come any closer and you better learn to heal your own wounds, because I won't be helping you.
A tense pause as this threat was weighed in.
Traitorous dog!
Sneered Leif, slapping ARanDom's shoulder as he turned to go.
Come on!
And the two slunk to the other side of the clearing to make a start on the fire. Frithia watched them go, her attention snapping back to the man before her as Enrik crouched, sheathing the blade and taking a moment to loosen the ropes at her wrists, her fingers throbbing as life flowed back through them, pulse matched by the smart tattoo just beneath her ribs.
Thank you.
Enrik just snorted, avoiding her eyes as he loosely bound her hands once more and made a final check of the knots.
Don't thank me. You were right, I did pick the wrong side, and you'll know it soon enough.
Cool dawn was creeping over the canopy, a weak, grey light breaking through the leaves to dapple lambent across the forest floor. A no-man lay still in the warmth of his bedroll, watching the glowing embers of the fire pit reflect in the eyes of those about it. Everyone was already awake, and he wondered who of them had even managed to sleep. He had not.
Ah, it's no good,
sighed Imoen, heaving off her blankets and making to sit, her face pale and puffy.
I'm getting up. Here, Minsk, throw me the tea.
And there was a suddenly burst of activity as the others sat about her, Jahara gathering the last of the night's wood to coax the fire back to life, the remaining water placed over it to heat. A no-man hauled himself up, beard prickling his palms as he scrubbed them across his face, the cool air rushing in as he swapped the blankets for his cloak and buckled on his belt. He felt half dead, corpse stiff and just as sharp, something clearly being suffered from by some of the others, though the remedies were questionable. Athik was rolling his shoulders, taking a swig from a narrow bottle a no-man suspected held something very warming as he waited for the tea to brew, the man passing it to Minsk with a nod and grin. Valigar seemed more alert though, sat lacing on his boots and keeping half an eye on Imoen as she busied herself getting out the rations, Jahara at the fire, a collection of cups at her feet. Behind her, Brianna was pulling her fingers through her dark hair, taking out the worst of the knots before she made to rebraid it once more, Erina seemingly giving up on her own as she twisted the scratty golden rope up and just secured it with a pin. A no-man snorted to himself, at least he had not that concern, a hand run through his short hair all the attention it needed. Indeed, after 5 days in the wilds, he was surprised how tidy some of them looked. Solafane sat a few paces from him in the circle, swathed in cloak and an immaculate blanket of long white hair that had yet to be tied back and covered by his hat, his brow lowered in a near-permanent frown. Strangely enough, it had been he who had objected most strongly to Frithia's plan. Perhaps he had seen nothing so wrong in her first suggestion. But when Frithia had held firm, his protests had been the first to silence and he had hardly spoken a word since, the man still sulking now, a curt nod of thanks sent to Imoen in return to the cup she had passed him.
Right,
the girl sighed, handing the last cup to a Noman with a smile and settling in her blankets once more.
Well, that flatbread should be ready soon, we can take breakfast, get packed up and be off. Indeed,
agreed Jahara,
though they will have likely walked well into the night, we should wait a few hours more here before setting out after them.
Valigar drew a sip of tea, dark eyes surveying the forest about them.
We must take care we are not discovered again.
Aruna was looking worried.
Do you think we should wait that long? What if the tracks go cold? We can follow at a greater distance this time,
offered Brianna.
Fritha said she would try to leave us a trail.
Jahara nodded.
Yes, though we should not rely on that, we do not know how much freedom she will have. Fritha cannot risk discovery, they have shown themselves quite ruthless enough in the past.
Aruna started as a large hand landed heavily on her shoulder.
Do not fret, young Aruna, Minsk and Bu will not lose young Fritha. Yeah,
echoed Imoen.
Fritha'll be all right, escaping's part of the plan after all. She lets them take her to this camp of theirs, then gives them the slip. We track them to the camp, meet up with her and then... And then?
asked Athik.
What exactly are we supposed to do against a whole camp of guards?
An uncomfortable pause.
We'll just have to decide that once we're there,
said Imoen firmly. Another long pause, the breathy sips of tea and crackle of firewood the only sounds to lift the silence.
I wonder if Fritha is all right,
murmured Aruna in the question no one had yet dared to voice.
It seems a little late to be raising concerns for that now,
muttered Solafane. Imoen frowned.
She will be. She said she wouldn't let them hurt her, that if they tried anything she'd just, grr, and then wait for us to catch up. And then we'll just have to work something else out. If that is still to be a possibility,
hissed Solafane,
then perhaps we should have done so in the opening. You surfacers! You treat your enemies with more care than your allies.
And before any reply could be made, the drow had risen and stalked from the clearing.
Fritha will be fine,
said Imoen again to the stunned silence he had left. It was starting to sound like a mantra.
Of course, Bu says young Fritha is strong.
A Noman sighed, draining his cup to pull on his boots and rise as well.
I am going to make my prayers.
And a Noman left them to their mutual reassurances, the familiar weight of the mace at hip chiming with each step against the blade buckled next to it. When the time had come, she had just discarded most of her belongings in a pile, but perhaps Fritha had sensed his unspoken worry, for she had made point of giving her sword to him, telling him to keep it safe for her and that she would be back for it. He halted, his hand closing unthinkingly about the scabbard, the blue enamel cool in his palm, the leather-bound hilt worn and molded with use by a grip much smaller than his own as he half drew the blade, the weak light catching on the hatching of nicks and scratches. It was scarred, just like its owner. She had told them she would be fine, had even managed a laugh as she had assured them she would not put up with any nonsense, but what now would Fritha count as worth the sacrifice? She had already once walked blithely into torture in order to serve as mere distraction. What would she do now to maintain her act and reach that camp? Would she let them hurt her? Starve her? Would she let them? A wave of nausea, his hand tightening about the hilt until it hurt, the pain the only release he could find for the overwhelming anger that burned for his own folly. He should not have let the plan go ahead, he should have just refused, demanded they find another path. But he had not, kept silent by his ongoing pretense against feelings he was no longer supposed to hold. Heavy footfalls, a Noman turning back to see Brianna arrive behind him.
Ah, a Noman, forgive me, I was just looking for a place to make my worship as you were.
Anomen said nothing, just sheathed the blade once more, Brianna continuing kindly,
"So many making prayers for her, the heavens must be ringing with her name. She will be fine, Anomen, her destiny shines brightly, it will not be extinguished at so early a juncture. I am not worried for her end, I am worried for her. She is strong,"
pressed Brianna.
"She is careless, in that she cares little for her own well-being. I should have refused, demanded we find another path."
Brianna had little sympathy for this pointless regret.
"Well, we did not, and this is the path we agreed to walk, fools that we are. We had an alternative, though none, it seems, would take it, would have pressing that man into telling us have been so terrible, I wonder."
The cool air felt sharp on the back on his throat.
"What? You would have had us torture a captive?"
Brianna scowled.
"And what would you prefer? We can control our own actions. Now she is at their mercies. At least we know what we are capable of, can you say the same for them?" "Do not tell me that!"
Anomen roared back.
"And who are you to speak of what we are capable? The last captive at your mercy did not live long enough to be offered any threat."
Brianna was defiant in her surprise.
I brought him justice." "You slit his throat." "He was a murderer and our enemy, had we returned him to any court not biased to the fact he is a soldier of this land, he would have been hung." "Are you so blind? Such lawless murder is not Torm's way any more than it is Helm's."
Her eyes were dark and unrelenting, though her tone was softer. A hand reached out to rest lightly on his wrist.
"I am sorry, Anomen, I know sometimes I am not the paragon of my brethren, but I try. Had that soldier been left alive, Frithla would have been forced to leave him to die slowly or pressed to tend him, to bring him with us, slowing our pace and possibly placing our group in further jeopardy should reinforcements have pursued us. I could not place that choice upon her. I had an instant to make the decision and I made it."
She sighed, finally dipping her face as she added,
I understand your objections though. When we return to Marmont, I will seek out the High Father at the temple and make whatever penance he decides. You will not speak of my failure to the others, will you?"
Anomen sighed and shook his head.
"No, and I understand your struggle. But, please, Brianna, guard against your anger. It is hard coming back on that road once it has been started upon, and I cannot be the support to you as others were to me."
She nodded, smiling weakly, his wrist suddenly cold as she released him.
"Well, I'll leave you to your prayers. Thank you, Anomen."
They set out a few hours later, as Jaehaera had planned, following the trail back southwest through the gloomy forests. The drone of insects and the song of birds mere accompaniments to all-pervading thrum of life in that rich wilderness, though the druid was finding it difficult to take pleasure in the sensation. Even though they had had the 2-day journey back towards Marmont before Frithla had left their company, they had never really found the chance to speak outside of the girl offering her a brief apology for their argument, Frithla blandly taking all the blame for it squarely on herself and putting it down to a bad day. But it was not as simple as that, and Jaehaera's own fears on the matter were not so easily dismissed. The druid shook her head. It was becoming clearer to her that Frithla was remembering her time in the care of the Baalites. Recollections of these past abuses manifested in this anger she seemed to hold for the world, and all who dwelled within it. Actions she would have once balked at, now put forward as viable options, and Jaehaera just wished she had managed to talk to the girl without it descending into the usual argument. To make Frithla see that her worries were not for what she was, but what she could become, Jaehaera seeing so clearly the girl losing herself in her effort to save everything else. But it always came out wrong, like an accusation, and there in the back of her mind the Harpers always lingered, a doubt she could never quite quell. Jaehaera wanted to believe, but so many had to be wrong for her to be right. Perhaps Fritha sensed as much. The druid knew well the pain of being distrusted by those once named friends.
Hold,
came Valigar ahead of her. The man stopped at one of the many shallow rivers that wound through the mangroves.
Minsk, a moment, please. What's wrong?
Demanded Imoen, instantly between them.
The trail stops here, and I can see nothing of it on the other side. I wonder if they haven't walked along the river itself, a precaution against anyone else attempting to track them. Who says those ferns look disturbed?
Offered Minsk, the man stepping down and wading to the opposite bank for a better look.
We can't lose her. We will not, young Imoen, but we will need a moment to be sure.
A frustrated sigh as the girl whipped back and left them to their task, those about her bearing delay a little better, Athik and Arana muttering quietly. Anomen stood, nervously adjusting and readjusting his left bracer, Brianna closing to murmur some comfort at his shoulder. Solafane was apart from the others, leaning back against a tree, hat pulled low despite the forest's gloom, his mouth a grim line beneath the brim. Jahara recalled his outburst that morning. They must have all seemed so strange to him, the woman catching his eye to send him a nod and close the gap between them.
So, are you feeling better now you have vented your temper?
No, he answered bluntly. Jahara frowned.
If you thought this such a poor plan, why did you not raise some objection to it? I did, but once Fritha was decided, what can I do but follow her orders? Someone among us has to show some faith in her.
Jahara ignored this not so subtle jibe.
And I suppose you would have preferred we torture our captive.
But the drow just sighed, and shook his head.
Not at all, but Fritha was right. This is a war you are fighting, and I would have gone along with that course if she had thought there no other way.
The silvery eyes locked with hers.
I would have volunteered to take up the task, and save her from its trauma. She never would have let you. No.
He conceded grimly, to the truth they had already known.
Perhaps this course is the better one. Such things can leave scars that never heal.
At the river, a decision had been reached.
Vals is sure of the way, come on.
And, once more, they set out. They walked until the twilight was so deep they could no longer follow the trail, Valigar more than aware such restrictions would not hold back those they were following. There was no room for the tents, but he preferred it this way, the sky clear enough that they even dispensed with the canvas in the end, all taking a quick meal together before bedding down under the stars. Valigar awoken by Arana a few hours later to take his watch with Solafane. The drow was off doing a walk of the perimeter now, though Valigar wondered if this was not just to allow his eyes some time away from the fire, where they could enjoy the darkness properly. The ranger understood it, too. The wilder places always filled him with a sense of peace that had once been alien in his life of servants and expectations. He wondered how the estate was faring in his absence. It was more than probably fine, it had always managed well enough without him before. The corn would be ripening in the southern holdings, Nentat likely down there checking the yields. Back at the house, the men would be working in the gardens, keeping them verdant in the rising Athkatlan heat. Mab with all the kitchen windows thrown wide in that sweltering kitchen, all the servants gathering outside at the end of each day, taking their suppers in the herb garden in the evening's cool. For a moment he almost missed the place. Valigar glanced down to the girl laid sleeping in the bedding next to his, Imoen writhing in her blankets as she no doubt fought with the demons of another nightmare. He had first noticed them when they had left Diarna's keep, those nights they slept outside their tents finding her the same. Initially, he had put it down to her worries for her missing friend, but Fritha had returned after Saradush and the dreams had continued without abatement. It had not been his place to question it before, but now. Valigar leaned forward, brushing the hair from her face in a gesture he would have found too awkward had she been awake. He had been concerned at first, their talk in the inn revealing their very different approaches to relationships, but they had found a middle ground over the last few days, the ranger accepting the fact that there was nothing so terrible in sharing an embrace or glancing kiss before those you knew well, while she seemed to realize there were many things that did not need words. It seemed strange, especially considering their dissimilarities, but he was with her, for the first time in a while, he was happy. A sharp gasp beside him, Imoen suddenly sat up in her blankets and panting wildly.
Are you all right?
She spotted him immediately and nodded, flopping back down into her bedding with a weary sigh.
Yeah, just a bad dream.
Valigar watched her reach under her pack for her flask.
It may help if you speak of it. Nah, it's fine,
she dismissed, a little too easily, throwing the canteen back under her bag.
I am due on watch yet. Not for another hour. Are you sure you are well, Imoen? You seem to have the same nightmares every night. I told you, Vals, I'm fine. Where's Solafane? Doing a walk of the perimeter. Ah, off to enjoy a brood all to himself,
she snorted.
Honestly, he's been walking along with a face on him all day.
Valigar sent her a shrewd look.
He is worried, as are you, he merely does not bother taking pains to hide it.
Imoen forced a laugh that ended more of a sigh.
Damn, I thought I had fooled you, too. But what are you to like me for, if not my happy-go-lucky charm?
Valigar quirked a smile.
I will no doubt find something.
Imoen snorted, patting his leg and turning over to nestle down in her blankets once more.
Well, I'll leave you to that. You can tell me what it is when you wake me for my watch.
Fritha kept her head down and her feet moving. It made things easier for everyone. They had been traveling for 3 days now, southwest through the forests, that morning finally finding them break from the Mere's gloom for the sun-baked plains, the marching mountains looming at their backs, and though she could not see it, she knew the river Aegis would be traveling its course westward before them, Fritha waiting for her eyes to catch on that silver sliver as they continued their march north towards it. She had been leaving what trails she could, tearing leaves and dragging her heels, as well as more obvious signs, a tuft of wool from her cloak, or some symbol scratched into the dirt. It was hard to find her moment, though, even at night, someone was always awake, watching the forest, watching her. Fritha could still feel Lef's gaze boring into her back, as though he was just waiting for her to close her eyes. She knew he was doing it to frighten her, it worked, too. Enric stayed close by, especially once the sun had set, and she was grateful to him for it, the man the sole reason she had managed to get any sleep at all, curled under her cloak as cold stars wheeled above the canopy. And yet, for all that, unexpectedly, the worst thing was the silence. Outside of occasional comment from Enric, no one spoke to her, the girl just led along behind them or tied on the edge of camp like some sort of animal, perhaps that was how they saw her. But, with any luck, it would all be over soon. They would be arriving at their destination shortly from how the men were talking, Fritha carefully scanning the horizon for some large fence or fort and slowly working on loosening her bonds in anticipation, though their arrival was not as she had been expecting.
Here we are,
sighed Ambreen, Fritha watching as a small collection of buildings crested the slight slope before them. And there it was, the broad waters of the Aegis a-rippling white in the sunshine, neat wooden houses clustered before it, intermingled with warehouses and corrals of horses and cattle, and, for one comical moment, she thought that this was the camp, some small community where children had been hidden for their own safety. But as they closed, Fritha saw her mistake. It was a village, likely sprung up from trade around a ferry crossing, and Fritha wondered if they were about to cross the river when.
"Is the boat in yet?"
Graven shouted, as they closed to an outlying corral, the man straightening from the horse he had been tending to bob a respectful half-bow.
"No, sir, but shouldn't be long now."
"Boat? Boat?" Fritha felt her muscles tense, her step faltering, this moment of indecision of whether to stay or flee an instant too long, strong hands clamping about her arms.
"Come on now, pedal,"
sneered Lev, breath sour at her ear.
"We don't want to be late."
Their arrival was clearly not something out of the ordinary, people nodding politely to the surrounding soldiers as they made their way down the main and only avenue, children pausing in their games to watch their passage, Fritha suppressing the temptation to try and force the change. In such a place the result would have been no less than a massacre. They had reached the river by now, the men bringing her to a halt at the end of a wooden jetty, and Fritha's vain hopes that they would just be taking the ferry across died then.
"Ah, and here it is,"
crowed Lev, Fritha watching with a growing dread as a large, single-sailed barge rounded a bend in the river and slowed to pull up at the quay before them, a few of the soldiers milling about the deck throwing ropes down to the waiting men. The gangplank hit the wooden boards but a pace from her feet. Fritha stared up at it, the horror of realizing that where they were about to take her she could not be tracked, leaving her legs weak, and she let her knees buckle, anything to delay that moment when she was forced aboard.
"Come on, you!"
snarled Lev, the man hauling her to her feet, he and Ambrine huffing as she was practically carried up the gangplank. They could work for their victory. On deck, and she found her legs once more, the pair handing her over to another soldier who marched her to the stern hatchway and hauled it back, wooden steps disappearing down into the gloom.
"There, get inside."
The smell hit her like a physical wall, instinct forcing her to draw a breath through her mouth that instantly made her gag, the reek of stale sweat, urine, and unwashed bodies cloying in her nostrils. The hold was packed with people, all wearing the same miserable grey expression, hunched and broken. A few turned to take in the arrival, most didn't bother, this was nothing new. The soldier a few rungs above encouraged her forward with his boot.
"Go on, women are on the other side."
The other side of a large cargo net was to what he was referring. There looked to be only 5 women within the score or so there, a net sectioning off a separate section of the hold for them, though for whose safety Fritha did not like to guess, a hulking half-orc women scowling at their passage. The soldier seemed to be pressing her to the corner where a sleeping woman had been given as wide a berth as was possible in the cramped conditions, the girl curled upon her side, pale and sweating, her short blonde hair plastered in thick clump to her face and neck.
"There's room enough here." "Shift you lot," I said, shift.
A strong hand on her shoulder forced Fritha to sit, and finally her bonds were removed. The woman next to her muttered feverishly in her sleep, though she did not awaken.
"Here, a cup for your water. Don't lose it." What's wrong with her?" "What does it matter? Just pray you don't get it, too."
The soldier was already gone, no desire to linger down there to catch some disease or shank. Fritha wiped the first beads of sweat from her brow, the heat and stench combined enough to leave her faint. A slam of the trapdoor, cheerful shouts from the jetty as the ropes were thrown back up, and her stomach lurched with the hold as they slowly pulled away. Imoen sat upon her bedding, legs forming a ring in which a slightly muddy handkerchief, a tuft of blue wool and a black thong necklace holding a jade stone, key and ring to Gond were being glumly scrutinized. The end to another day had come, the third spent following the trail, and Imoen was more than tired of feeling like that, so sick with a worry that never quite left her. Why was it always Fritha buggering off into danger and leaving her behind to worry about it? A small part of Imoen reminded her that she herself had been the one in danger in Saradush, and it was Fritha who had been the worried one once she had known, but Imoen was not feeling particularly reasonable just then. She was anxious and fretful and tired to her bones, every night spent in dreams that seemed only to get worse. Imoen shook herself, pulling her mind away and focusing on the talk of those about her. After all, it was bad enough she had to spend the time she should be resting struggling with them, without letting the visions torment her waking hours, too.
"There's a river not far from here, right?"
questioned Erina of no one particular, the girl making attempts to comb out her greasy hair before bed.
"I might go for a wash before we break camp tomorrow."
Brianna was nodding, eyeing her own dark braid with a displeased frown.
"I may come, too." "I don't know why you girls bother,"
laughed the man between them.
"You've nothing clean to put on, and you'll only get dirty again. I say, just go with it." "Athik, you only used to visit the bathhouse once a week even when we were in town. There's nothing wrong with smelling like a man." "There is if you're a woman,"
corrected Erina archly. Even Solafane managed a laugh.
"So,"
offered Imoen cheerfully to the silence that followed,
"what's the plan for tomorrow?"
Jahara sighed, taking up the map she had been reading only moments before.
"Well, we are about 2 days from the forest's edge. I suspect the trail will head south then, towards the mountains. The river Aegis lies to the north and the area will be too populated to keep anything the size of this camp hidden for long. The mountains themselves are only a few days from here,"
added Anomen, perhaps he sensed her unease.
"I suspect we will not have to follow them for much longer, my lady."
Imoen smiled and nodded, the conversation turning to more domestic matters as the group bedded down for the night, Minsk and Athik on the first watch. Valigar was in his usual place beside her, slowly unpacking his bedding next to hers, the distance between them closing over the last few days to now mere inches, the man frowning as he held the corner of some blanket up to the light to examine the wear. He was not a handsome man, not like Solafane or Anomen or even Niklos had been, Mask bent his pics. But he had a presence to him, a certain confidence that was stirring. And though he did not kiss or play as she would have once said she preferred, ever since Marmont he had taken the time to help her pack or warn her of some hidden stone or route as he walked ahead of her, just small things to show his regard, and Imoen found she rather liked this quieter sort of affection. She studied him now, the broad forehead that never seemed far from a frown, the full, determined mouth and the dark eyes where she would often spy the smiles he would have preferred to keep hidden. After almost a 10-day away from Marmont, his beard fuller than it had been, the short black hair looking almost fluffy, a thought that yielded a snort of amusement, the man glancing up to catch her watching.
"Is something the matter? You've got food on your face, just joking."
She laughed as he briskly wiped a hand across his jaw. Valigar frowned, but she could tell he was trying not to smile. "So," Imoen continued blithely, settling down amongst the blankets, the man next to her still sat as he rooted through his pack.
"Out of the forests tomorrow and then maybe south, at least we'll be out in the sunshine."
Valigar looked suddenly rather sad.
"You do not have to pretend, Imoen." "Yeah, I do,"
she snorted, part laugh, more sigh.
"I half fool myself sometimes. Gods, I would give anything for just a decent night's sleep. It may help to talk of it."
He had not said of what, but they both knew what troubled her. Imoen hesitated for only a moment.
"I am somewhere dark, under the sky though it is not night. There is fire everywhere, engulfing the walls around me, the buildings sometimes me. People are screaming, running everywhere, so frightened, and there's this voice, this horrible voice, low and growling like some sort of demon, and it's roaring, it's telling them they're going to die. I had dreams like this before we even went to Saradush. I saw the siege, well, sort of, in that I saw a city on fire and this huge wave of blood. Valigar, I think might be dreaming of the future. What do you think I should do? I know little about the divination schools of magic. Perhaps Aruna? No, please,
she cut in, aware of how pathetic she sounded.
I don't want the others to know. It would only worry them and they'd ask questions, and I don't want that. We've all got enough to be fretting about at the moment.
Valigar held her gaze for a long while, but, at last, he nodded, lying down behind her.
Come, we should get some sleep.
Imoen smiled, burrowing down beneath the covers. It did feel a bit better now she had talked about it. Perhaps she should have listened to him the first time. She would have to mind that stubborn streak. The group couldn't afford to like Fritha. Valigar shifted closer, the blankets bunching between them as he scooped an arm loosely about her, feeling of his forearm flex filling Imoen with less of a thrill and more a comforting warmth. He would be there for her and whatever was coming, Imoen knew she wouldn't have to face it alone. Fritha let her head loll against the narrow bulkhead, the women laid out next to her stirring fitfully in the afternoon's heat, and Fritha mustered just enough energy to fan her with the handkerchief she had found in the woman's pocket, Fritha's own one left under a bush somewhere in the mere, a clue for anyone able to find it. About her, similar scenes were being played out in the cramped hold, people slumped in the stifling reek, though the smell did not bother her as it had once had. Fritha doubted she smelt any better now. Her first day on board had dragged, but it had been nothing compared to last night. Fritha curled against the curving side of the ship, listening to the lap of the water, her dreams nightmares of drowning that had not haunted her since the gate. She had awoken late, ill-rested, thirsty, and utterly devastated to find she had missed the morning's round of bread and water, though perhaps that was for the best. Facilities down there comprised of a single bucket which was only emptied once a day, a filthy curtain of sailcloth slung across it in an attempt at privacy. The woman groaned in her sleep, Fritha using the handkerchief to wipe the sweat from her face. Soon, she promised quietly, brushing the pale hair back and straightening her old blue cloak, the bundle of wool serving the unconscious woman as pillow. A brief examination the day before had yielded nothing more than the woman was gravely ill and with something that was probably not contagious considering no one else down there had yet to contract it. That Fritha had no skill there was frustrating enough, but the knowledge a cleric could have likely healed her in an instant was more infuriating still, Fritha's whole being railing against such needless suffering. The woman had been no better that morning, and it was then Fritha had enjoyed a brief spark of insight, the girl gently searching her body to find the cup each of them were issued on arrival. Fear of infection had kept it with her, it seemed. Fritha went back to her fanning, a burning sense of urgency keeping her in motion even as tired muscles whimpered in protest. She was not dead yet, there was still a chance. The clatter of the trapdoor was the sound she had been waiting for, the press about her all seeming to start as she did, another faceless soldier clattering down into the hold. Perhaps it was her state of mind, but Fritha was beginning to think those men all looked the same, this one carrying a large bucket of water, which he set on the steps behind him.
Right, line up. Women first, bring your cups.
Fritha rose with a speed that surprised even her, snatching up the woman's cup along with her own to pick her way eagerly across the press of bodies, the girl holding steady the cups he was filling even as she begged,
"Please, someone is ill. If I could just get a message to Karstil."
It was as though she had not spoken.
Next. She might die. I said next. Just move, will you, girl?
Shouted someone behind her, others growing restless, and Fritha felt something inside her break, the lump in her throat rising as she realized not one among them cared. She turned away, head bowed as she made her way back, a broad chest suddenly halting her passage, the once cream tunic now stained and grubby, sweat ringed in fetid yellow tide marks around the armpits and collar. It was undone almost to the navel, revealing a crop of dark hair and a much emaciated chest beneath. Fritha glanced up, the face above her young and terracotta-skinned, the youth likely a Termian by his coloring, dark eyes narrow and almost lost to the bushy brows above, a good 10 days of growth darkening his chin. He smiled, showing both rows of white, if crooked, teeth.
"All right there, flower,"
he greeted, his accent broad and placing him closer to the gate than the sea of fallen stars.
"I wouldn't bother asking anything of that one, lass, that bloke wouldn't give you the steam off his piss. Here," he continued kindly, "I know how this sounds, but that woman is dead anyway. It's just a waste giving her anything. Listen, you give me her ration, and I promise to keep an eye on you in camp."
"No," said Fritha flatly, the man backing up a step as she made to push past, a hint of urgency creeping in.
"Come on now, pretty girl like you, you're bound to catch the eye and perhaps by friends you ain't keen on making. It will pay to have an ally or two." "I said no."
He let her pass that time, Fritha almost spilling the water in her blind haste to be away from them all and back in her little corner of hell.
"Here, I've got our water,"
she whispered, setting down her own cup to gently ease the woman's head up, the second cup to her lips. The eyelids fluttered but did not open, the water spilling uselessly down her chin.
"Please, just swallow, please."
A couple of mouthfuls was all she managed to get down her, half a cup of water poured out before Fritha gave up for the moment. The girl bent over her own cup and drawing the occasional sip, the tears dripping from her chin to ripple the liquid within. It was dusk when they at last broke from the Mere's canopy, the rolling plains golden under the sinking sun, the marching mountains rising to the south, great brown columns to the sky, supporting the tiers of pink and amber. All had assumed that they would be turning to head south towards those smoking peaks, but, faint as it was, Minsk was sure the trail turned north, something Valigar concurred, and the first violet fingers of evening were reaching over the forests they had left when they arrived at that village. It was a tiny place, small enough to not even warrant a tavern, just a huddle of small livestock farms all gathered about a single dirt track street that led straight to the river, such villages often closing with the day, and their passage was marked by the slamming of shutters and rasp of latches, Jahara feeling the wary frowns follow them as they passed.
"Friendly, here isn't it?" "Mon,"
the druid hissed, raising her voice as she called out to a man who was busy securing his barn for the night,
"Your pardon, but did you see a group of soldiers pass through here a few days back?"
Worn eyes were instantly narrowed with suspicion.
"Who wants to know?" "We are mercenaries hired by the Tethiran army. We were told to meet a contact here to receive our assignment, but the Mere delayed us."
Jahara had thought it an open enough lie, but it clearly had not been the thing to say, the man dropping the bar down across his doors and immediately marching for the nearest house.
"I don't know nothing." "They were here, then,"
murmured Aruna. Jahara nodded.
"Indeed, the only question being, where did they go?" "The ferry would be the most probable choice,"
offered Valigar,
"though, if this camp is over the river it cannot be much further. These lands will only become more populated as we head north."
The river was molten under that sky, rushes and reeds cleared for the narrow wooden quay that ran along the bank almost the entire width of the village, the ferry station at the eastern end, while a few stout-hulled barges were docked at narrow jetties to the west, huge sails brought in for the night, like birds at roost.
"What do we think?"
asked Athik, eyeing the moored flat-bottomed ferryboat with an appraising frown.
"I reckon a bit of coin could convince the ferryman to delay his dinner." Well, I don't fancy just going across without being sure,
sighed Imoen, her eyes catching on something sat a little further down the quay.
Just wait here a moment. All right there,
she called, friendly grin hitched in place ready as the swarthy young boy started back, the fishing rod he was holding almost dropped in his alarm.
How are they biting?
A shrug was her only reply, Imoen ambling casually down the wooden jetty to crouch beside him, his dark eyes fearful as she continued.
Hey there, my name's Beth. I was just looking for some friends of mine. You might have seen them, shiny armor and green cloaks. I'm not supposed to talk about the soldiers,
he mumbled hastily.
No, I know, and it's really good you're being careful. We're here to help them, you see, but we got here late and now we don't know where they've gone.
A slight frown, the boy giving her as penetrating a stare as he seemingly dared, as though trying to assess her honesty, before the gaze shifted and he was staring down the quay to the group she had left, his eyes lingering on the brightly painted shield that hung at a gnome's back.
Is that man a knight? Yes, he is,
said Imoen eagerly, she had a bite.
And the lady next to him is, too. They fought in the big battle at Saradush, did you hear about that? I know you're doing what you're told, but we just need to know if they got the ferry here.
A nervous bob of that scrawny throat end.
They sometimes get the ferry. But they have their own boat, too. It usually docks over there at the last jetty, behind Call's barge.
Imoen followed the hand he had thrown to the other end of the quay, a high call from the house behind starting them both.
Milt, come in now, your supper's ready. Coming, ma'am.
They followed the boy's gesture, walking back along the quay, past all four of the moored barges to the last jetty, the narrow wooden berth shared with another boat, the gangplank lowered, a cargo of flour and wool stacked neatly either side. Imoen ignored it, walking right to the end to gaze down the amber river as it wound its way west into the sunset, the breeze stirring her hair with the scent of grasses and wood smoke. Was Frithia down there somewhere in those golden plains, or was she north, where the twilight was already creeping across the sky?
So which? She was here.
And Imoen turned to see Minsk straighten from a crouch with it held fast between his fingers, a single hair, gossamer fine and rippling in the air, the silk line of some tiny amber spider. No one spoke, the tense silence suddenly broken by a jaunty whistling. The slam of a hatchway, and he appeared on the deck next to them, the man of middling years, but still spry enough with it, a last sack of flour over his shoulders as he strolled down the gangplank. The tune died on his lips the instant he saw them, the man suddenly halted but a pace from the jetty and frowning. Jahara raised a hand in greeting.
Pardon, friend. I ain't your friend, half-elf,
he cut in, pointedly dropping the sack to land with the others just at their feet. A long pause, Imoen continuing brusquely, you call? We heard from a bloke in the village that you're the one to speak if we need to get a message to our contact in the 7th Battalion. But the man just laughed.
You never heard that from anyone. I know what you're looking for, and I ain't speaking of it to outsiders, whatever side they claim they're on.
Brianna sighed tersely, the woman frowning as she stepped forward.
You are right, sir, and I am sorry we lied, but our companion has been taken and we have been searching for her since. We would be happy to reimburse you for any information you could give us, either in coin or service. You got nothing I need. Please,
cried Arana,
we just want to find our friend. I'll tell you nothing, I hope that boat sinks and drowns the lot of them, filthy ballspawn.
Minsk lunged forward, about to try to persuade him otherwise, at least he would have, if he had reached him first, a no-man's fist suddenly around the man's throat.
Tell me now, or by helm. A no-man, let him go. Anno. Help! Get off! Get off me! Someone, do something!
Solifane had the solution at his hip. A deft blow from his sword pommel and the man fell limp. A no-man dropped him as though he burnt.
Did you kill him?
Gasped Erina. Solifane nudged him with a careless foot.
No, but he will not be awakening for a while.
Brianna's concern was with their knight. The man turned from them, his head in his hands.
A no-man! Leave me!
The distant bang of a door. A pause as everyone waited for the shout that did not come. Jaehaera whipped to the boat next to them, something sparking in her eyes.
Everyone, get on board! Valigar cast off the mooring ropes. We're just going to leave him here?
Asked Erina, seemingly transfixed by the body at her feet.
No. Minsk, drag him behind those crates. We should be away before he is discovered.
Imoen suspected it was not quite what the girl had meant, but it was too late. Minsk hiding the body behind the goods he had just finished unloading, the rest of them piling aboard, Jaehaera at the tiller as the sail was raised, Valigar and Ithik pulling it away from the quay, and they were away, the village soon far behind them, swallowed by the dusk. It was a small barge needing a crew of no more than 2 to hold the tiller and man the sail, but it was a boat built for cargo and there was enough room for them all. The tiller braced as their group gathered before the single mast. A no-man sat alone in the bows, head in hands and silent since his outburst.
I can't believe we've stolen a boat,
cried Erina,
and left that man for dead. He was not dead,
corrected Solifane coolly.
They'll follow us for sure.
Brianna snorted.
That village was a hive of cowards. They will make no pursuit, though they may inform the next patrol. We must act quickly. So, what now?
Asked Ithik. Jaehaera nodded, glad to be moving forward once more.
Well, it is most likely anyone who took Fritha travelled downstream. The Aegis has its source in the mere, the way's too narrow for a barge of this size. But where do we go from here?
Cried Imoen, her friend could be anywhere, again.
We can't track them. There are villages just like that one all along this river. They could stop anywhere, pass her to another patrol and we wouldn't know. We don't know where they're going. One of us might,
came that grave voice, Imoen whirling to the man sat next to her. He could not mean. Jaehaera was frowning, impatient for her explanation.
Valigar. Imoen has been. I'll tell them myself.
Imoen snapped, angry she had no time to be furious with him just then.
I've been having dreams. Before Saradush I saw the city's siege and now I've been dreaming of a place, some buildings with a high wall around them. I suppose it could be this camp. You knew where to go all along?
Demanded Solifane.
Of course I bloody didn't. I don't know now. But you could give us an idea from your surroundings,
concluded Jaehaera. Imoen dipped her head, it seemed it was the only way.
Yeah, I could try.
Erina was sure she could modify her sleep charm for the task, the girl's voice mellow and almost soporific in itself as she laid a hand upon her shoulder, encouraging her to lie back upon the makeshift bed of cloaks that had been hastily arranged beneath her.
Just close your eyes and relax, let it come to you gradually.
A soft numbness was easing through her limbs, leaving her almost weightless as Imoen slipped back into the void, and then fire everywhere. flames engulfing the buildings around her, catching at her clothes, blistering her skin, and she could feel the hands restraining her as she fought to beat them out, Jahara's voice steady at her ear.
Calm, Imoen, it is just a dream, now tell me what you see.
Imoen gritted her teeth against the fear, forcing herself to look up, past the burning walls, the choked sky broken by those ominous black peaks.
Mountains, there are mountains very close by, 2 are higher than the rest, with a small one between them.
She let her attention drop once more, determined to get all she could from this, ignoring the screams and the inhuman roars, her eyes drawn to a break in the walls, where the fiery reflections were dancing across the darkened plains.
And a river, there's a river nearby, too. There.
She gasped, feeling the spell fade as her own magics pushed it back, many hands rushing in to steady her as she made to sit.
That's all I can see.
Jahara was already poring over the map, and Imoen almost did not want to know the answer.
Did it help?
The druid's smile left her in no doubt.
Yes. The camp is somewhere beneath this stretch of river here, it is a tributary to the Aegis. This map does not give the name, but it is the only river to flow beneath the Talos' trident. The mountains you saw, they are famed for their storms. Minsk and Bu will bring them a storm. Indeed, well, we have to get there first. Sailing will have to be taken in shifts. All those who do not know, gather before the tiller now and I will show you how to steer. Then will come the sail.
Imoen let them go. She had learnt enough on her voyage to Baldur's Isle, her gaze drawn to the map the druid had left, the thin blue line squiggling beneath the uneven row of mountains, 3 larger than the rest and labelled as Jahara had said. But they did not look like a trident to her, they looked like horns. Frithia awoke with a start, a jolt running through the ship, and, in the darkness, she could just make out the bodies stirring around her. The hold suddenly flooded with light as the trapdoor opened, a soldier clattering halfway down the steps.
Come on, get up, we're here.
Frithia glanced to the body next to her, the face discolored and bloated by the hold's heat. She had stopped drinking on the 3rd day, no amount of pleading parting those chapped lips, and the follow morning had found her dead. And there she had lain since, staring up at her with milky lifeless eyes. Frithia had thought the smell would have been unbearable, truth was, she hardly noticed. She would be in the river soon, water enough to quench her very soul.
You women first. Come on, I said move.
She stood, legs unsteady after so little use, Frithia trying not to trip as she stumbled after the woman in front of her. A pause at the hatch while manacles were closed about their wrists and each woman was linked to a rope, the 5 of them snaking from the hold in one long line. That first gust of cool night air hit her face like the breath of heaven, the deck rocking gently underfoot, and Frithia tipped her head back, eyes drinking in that vast field of stars, smoke from the distant mountains curling up to a smiling half-moon. And there beneath, it stood, dark against the plains. It looked to have been a building of another sort once, long ago, the crumbling stone ruin now fortified by 2 high wooden walls, a watchtower set on each corner of the inner one, the guards stationed within grim statues in the orange torchlight. It was impenetrable and quite enough to keep out a small army, let alone the handful of people following her. Things were not going to plan. The solid thud of the gangplank, their group marched down onto a narrow jetty, a few soldiers further down the quay unloading the supplies the boat had brought. The high banks of the river were set with a wall that looked much older than those docks, the lanterns at the far end glinting on the metal of a solid iron door, while beyond the jetty, a large water wheel turned with a sloshing creak. The men were being led off the boat behind them in 3 groups, at least 2 soldiers escorting each as they marched them up from the jetty and across that small plain, a half-dug moat leaving the air rich with the scent of fresh earth. The outer gates were already open, and Fritha felt it prickle across her skin as she passed under the shadow of the inner wall, and those two sets of gates swung shut behind them. Fritha turned her head back and forth, trying to get a good look at her surroundings past the tall woman chained in front of her. They were standing in a large, square courtyard from what she could see, a collection of long wooden buildings set about it, while the center was left clear, though perhaps not for long, a half-built stone wall silhouetted towards the western end. Fritha hoped her cell was a little more finished.
"Come on,"
came the sigh, all wrists feeling it as the soldier tugged on the rope.
"Women are in North Block."
And they were off again, their chains chiming merrily as they were hurried over to the long building that lined the right of the courtyard, Fritha glancing back to see the men being marched towards the buildings on the opposite side. 2 soldiers were on guard at the doors, one stepping down as they arrived, the man short and weaselly looking, his voice holding a smooth almost nasal quality that made Fritha feel sick.
"Hello there, ladies, welcome to North Block,"
he greeted, jangling a large ring of keys at them and clearly amused enough by his own wit that it didn't matter what the rest of them thought, the man unlocking their manacles one by one as he continued.
"Home to the beautiful daughters of Baal,"
he grinned widely as he got to her,
"and just opposite the barracks, should any of you get lonely."
Fritha forced herself not to react, the metal cuffs finally taken from her wrists and she was free to turn from his leer, the soldier from the boat dumping a rough woolen blanket into her arms and shoving her towards the doors.
"There, now find a bed and keep quiet."
The room was long and dark, 2 rows of women lay either side on beds that were little more than thin rush mats. The windows had shutters rather than glass, ones left open here and there, and moonlight fell in shafts across the rough floorboards. The other new arrivals were dispersing about her trying to find places of their own, and Fritha moved further along that central aisle, some of the women still curled as though asleep, others watching her pass, the light reflecting in their eyes.
"Oi, you there,"
rumbled a voice before her, a footstep forward into a shaft of moonlight revealing a tall, hulking woman who looked like she had more than a bit of giantess in her blood, ugly, grey face framed by 2 curtains of lank black hair. She was flanked by 2 others, a stout dwarven woman with fists the size of Fritha's head, and a wiry, dark-haired elf who looked to have seen more than a few battles, scars lightly hatching her bared arms and face. The giantess sneered.
"This end ain't for you, newcomer, get back to the doors."
Fritha remained silent, taking a couple of steps back before she turned cautiously, a hushed call piping out of the darkness.
"Here, there's a place here."
Someone about halfway down the room was waving to her, Fritha closing to see a young woman of her own age sat up in her bedding, her cocoa-colored hair cut short and tied back, the smile bright against her tan skin. She was wearing a long linen slip that had seen better days, robes neatly folded next to her bed with her boots, green, almond eyes curiously watching her approach.
"Thank you,"
murmured Fritha.
"Not a problem,"
the girl whispered, Fritha sinking onto the thin matting next to her.
"It's been strange having an empty bed next to me, since, well..."
She trailed off, silent a moment before plunging blithely on.
"That was Vagnus, she's in charge here in the North Dormitory. She was the first woman they brought to the camp."
The whisper dropped to a breathy hiss.
"They say she had already killed a dozen of our kind when they captured her. You had best stay out of her way."
The smile was back.
"I'm Jole."
"Freya," Fritha offered, hauling off her tunic and boots to throw them down next to her bed.
"Nice to meet you, Freya." "Quiet in there,"
barked a voice from the doors, the slam making the shutters rattle. A reassuring smile in the darkness.
"We had best get back to sleep. Night then."
Fritha just nodded, lying down to pull the thin blanket over her head, unable to help the tears as they began to well. Oh, what had she done now? End of chapter.